Hello everyone, I am Rod and I am the game design instructor for the Academy of Entertainment Arts over at Dixie Hollins High School. If you are one of my students, it's Mr. Flowers to you, and welcome to this video tutorial. Welcome back. In the last video we set up the ability to select an item inside of our inventory and represent it as equipped or not. In this tutorial we're going to go over how to set up the mechanics of the sword so that we can equip the sword and have it playable. Before we get into actually setting up the sword though, there's a few things we have to adjust for our player, and that's simply representing which direction our player is facing. If we look at our player sprite here, you can see that it's just a very simple block and there's really nothing to him. It's just a block. And I have no way of telling if I'm facing to the left or facing to the right. And this can be a crucial element if you're playing a platform game and you want to be able to identify which way your player is looking. So before we go ahead and start writing code, I'm going to edit this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to draw an arrow on him so I can see which way he's facing. Nothing too fantastic. I'm going to grab a color that's good, and then I'm going to grab the triangle. And my default starting position, probably going to have him facing to the left, so I will just draw a left arrow on him. So 1 dot, 2 dots, 3 dots. Good enough. And then I'll grab my bucket. I'll say, yep, that fixes that tool, and I'll just drop it in. And then I will go up and I will select this, copy, paste. And all I'm going to do is flip this frame. So I'll go to Image, make sure I'm on the frame I want to flip. Image, come down to Mirror. There's actually Flip and Mirror. I generally work in Photoshop, so Photoshop just does flip, left, right, up, or down. But in GameMaker, Mirror is left and right, and Flip is upside down. So I'm going to grab Selected Frame and mirror it. So now I have a left and a right. Simple enough. Let's come back to our object player here. And in my create event, I'm also going to add some variables to represent which direction I'm facing. So we have our equipped variable, and then right underneath that, I'm going to go ahead and give a is_facing, and I'll put in quotes here, left. And to be consistent with my style, I'm going to go ahead and make sure that this is set to capital none. That way I'm just consistent. So that should be fine here. And then the last thing I want to do inside my player is just to tell it that the image speed is set to 0. Because right now I only have 2 frames, and if we were to run this, you would see the player's image flip back and forth. And actually I'll demonstrate that here. If I just hit play, you can see the player is just running those 2 frames, and it just looks kind of silly. So I'm going to go ahead and close that. And in here, I'm just going to set the image_speed to 0. That way it doesn't flip the frames. Okay, let's go to our step event. And inside of our step event, I'm going to scroll down. And let's see, where do I want to put this stuff? Okay, so as I'm looking, alright, so we're going to come up here to where our player is, if keyboard check, our ORD A key, that allows us to move to the left. We're going to have to adjust this a little bit to represent which frame is to be drawn. So after this if, I'm going to open brace, hit enter, I'll come underneath that, I'll wrap this piece of code, and while we're in here, I'm going to say is_facing, I'll set that to left, and then I'll draw the correct image. So I'll say change direction, change, what it says, set velocity, and then under here, with our change direction piece, I'm just going to do image index is set to 0, because that should be our left frame. And then I'll copy this piece, I'll come down here to else if we hit the D key, we're going to the right, so I'm going to wrap that. I will paste the code above it. This is going to be facing to the right. I'll change the image. This is going to be image 1. And of course we'll have this be our set velocity. And then I'll wrap that, make sure that that's closed off. Open brace, closing brace. So now we should be able to play this and then be able to move left and right. So I'm going to go ahead and give that a quick check, make sure that's working. So here's my player. If I push left or right, you can see it changes and everything updates just fine. Okay. Now we can get into the whole equipment part. Right after this else statement, but just before our jump, I'm going to go ahead and add our weapon. So let's make a new spot and say equip item. We're going to say if equipped. So if our equip variable is true, then we're going to check to see if the weapon is available. So is weapon in hand. So if instance exists, obj underscore weapon. And this is going to be, we're actually going to set this to if not instance exists. So if the weapon does not exist, we will create it. So underneath that, I'm going to do a with statement. So with instance exists, or sorry, instance create. We're going to do a depth. I'm going to set this to the X and Y location of the player, and I'm going to set its depth value to -1. That way it's on top of the player. And then the object is going to be obj underscore weapon. And as we create this weapon, which is why we used a with statement, so with this weapon as it's being created, we are going to set its state. So state will be whatever is inside the player's equip slot. So obj underscore player dot equip. Now I know we're inside of the player here, and if we're trying to talk to a player variable, sorry, the periods doesn't belong there. That should be a semicolon. If we're inside an object and we're talking to its variables, we don't need to give the object's address. However, inside of a with statement, the with statement's actually talking to this object's variables. So what that means is I need to tell this object to look for the player's variable, because the player doesn't have this state variable in this particular case. So this would be talking to this object state, and then that object state is going to be this object's equipped. Okay, and that should be simple enough. That should be able to put the item in our hand. Before we can put the item in our hand, though, we do need to tell the weapon object to have the variable we're trying to talk to. So let's go to our object weapon, and we're going to create the necessary variables. So add event, create. Then in here, of course, we're going to do our initialize variables. So initialize variables. And I'm going to set the image index or image speed of our weapon to 0. That way it's not doing anything while it's in our hand. So image speed will be 0. And then we need our, of course, we need our state. So state will be set to none for now. And you can set this to 0 or whatever. I usually just, numbers don't really make sense in my brain unless the value has to be a number. So that's why I usually put a comment or whatever here. So it's going to be none. Now we're going to go inside of a step event. So add event, step, step. It's going to be update weapon. Inside of our step event, now the first thing we're going to do is tell the weapon item to destroy itself if the player does not have a weapon. So if not obj underscore player dot equipped. So if he's not equipped, then instance destroy. And I'll go ahead and label that. So if player is not equipped, destroy weapon. And then we're going to say change weapon state. So state will be whatever, of course, is inside the player's hand. obj_player.equipped. Now I do realize we've written this piece of code a few times, but there's a reason for that, and you'll kind of see that as we go. Inside the player, we have this being set as the object's being created, and inside of our create event, currently it's nothing. So we want the object to also check itself so that if we've changed the weapon inside of the inventory, it re-updates whatever's currently there every tick. So, okay. And now we're going to draw the actual weapon item. So for that, we want the weapon item to only really update once we are inside of the game. We're going to go ahead and do if obj game.state. So if the game state is in game, then we're going to do the rest of this code. That way we're not firing arrows or swinging the sword while we're trying to do stuff inside the inventory. So we're going to say switch, and we're switching our state, open brace, closing brace, and then our first case, this is going to be item list dot sword. Do a break here, and we're not going to do the bow in this part of the tutorial, but we are going to set up the case for it. So I'm going to say case, and this is going to be item list dot bow. And I'll do a break. Okay, so inside of our item list sword case here, we're going to start setting up the sprite for our sword. So the first thing is above our break, we're going to say change sprite, and that's going to be sprite index spr underscore sword. And then here, for our item list bow, we're also going to do this. I'm going to copy this, and inside the bow, I will paste that. And this will be spr underscore bow. And with this, we should be able to, at the very least, see the object in our player's hand. It's not going to be where it needs to be. We're going to have to do some finagling for that, but it should appear there. So I'll go ahead and play it. I'm going to go ahead and grab some items, grab this one, that one. And I'm going to go through the, well, whoops, I didn't set that up. Hey, look, more items. Go ahead and... Okay, so if I grab the sword, there's my sword, it pops on my player. If I grab the bow, there's the bow, it pops on my player. And that seems to be doing its job. That's awesome. Boop. And if I unequip, you can see that nothing is there. That works. Let's go ahead and fix the position of our sword. Right now it's right on top of the player. And I don't really want it to be on top of the player. I want to move it to where the player's hand might be. I know it's just a block, but I would say his hand's probably out here. So that's where I'm going to move it. Go ahead and close this, and we're going to do the positioning as the next line. So inside of our item list.sword case, right under the sword sprite, we're going to say set sword position. And this is where we're going to check to see the direction of the player. So if object player dot is facing, and we're going to do two equal signs to the left. So if the player is facing left, Then our sword is going to be, so the X position of our sword is going to be set to the X position of our player. But we're going to do it plus or minus some distance. In this case, it depends on how big your player is and where the hand of your player is likely to be at the moment the sword comes out. My player is a static player, so there's no animation for me to try to keep up with in the frame. So for me, if I look at my player here, the middle of my player is here, and my player is 64 and then 32. So if I push it out a few pixels this way, we'll say 16 or 32 pixels this way, it should appear right about there. And if I do it the other way, it'll appear over here. So inside my weapon object, I've noticed with the updated version of GameMaker 2, it doesn't auto-align my boxes anymore. So I have to do that manually, which is lame. So I'm going to have my left position of my player be minus 32. Again, you're going to have to kind of pick your battle here and figure out where exactly it's going to be for your object. And then for my Y position is going to be obj_player .y. I don't have a position up or down that I need to change it, so mine's just going to be at the default Y location, which is middle of my player. If your player's hand is not there at the moment it swings, then you might have to move that. And then I'm going to come out here, and underneath this if statement I'll do an else, open brace, closing brace, and then inside of here I'm going to paste the same code, so go ahead and paste the code. Except this time, I'm going to make this a positive 32. And I'm using an else because we only have two directions that we could be looking, left or right. So we're either looking left, else we're looking right. Go ahead and hit play. And once we equip this particular item, we should be able to see it ready to go. So grab it, equip it. There he is to the left or to the right of my player, and if I go to my left, it's to the left of my player. And which is really nice, it stays in line. And the reason we want to keep our variables of our object inside the object is if we were to do this inside the player, there would be a moment delay or for when this object updates. So you would actually see as I jump, the sword might trail as a delayed response to my player's positioning. So by keeping it inside of the actual object of the weapon, it stays up to date, ready to go. Okay, so now I want to make it to where my sword does something when I swing it. And that part's pretty easy. The next part is attack with sword. So I'll say if, and the button I'm going to use for my sword is going to be on my mouse. I'm going to say mouse, check, button pressed. And you could do, I'm doing a check button press so I don't have a repeat of the action. But if you wanted the action to repeat by when you hold the button down, then you would just remove the pressed and it would just run it every time. This is going to be my mouse button left. And then under here, I'm going to do image_angle. And I'm going to set that whenever I click the button that it rotates my sword 90 degrees. And if I look at my sword here, where the handle is, my handle, or the origin point of my handle is right here. And as my sword rotates, it should rotate along that origin point, which is great because it'll make it look like it's swinging downward rather than just turning in circles. Like if I had put this in the middle here, it would just spin around the origin point, whereas this one it just kind of leans. Back to our object weapon. So I'm going to do a 90-degree rotation. And then I'm going to say else. So this is if I let go of the button. So if I push the button, it rotates 90, else it rotates to 0. So image angle is 0. Now, the way to know where your image angle is, if we look at our sword again, by default here, to the right of your object is the 0 position. So this is 0, and then this is 90, this is 270, this is 180, this is 270, and this would be 360 or 0 again. But my sword is already facing upward. My sword's already pointing 90 degrees up, which means my default position is 0. It's confusing, I realize. But think of this as like a compass, okay? And it really just matters where your picture starts. If I had my sword starting where it was pointing to the left or to the right, then it would be pointing towards 0, and then rotating at 90 would stand it up. In this case, it's already pointing up, so if I rotate at 90, it's going to be laying downward toward the 180 position. And then if I wanted it to go that way, I'd have to rotate it 270 degrees, because it's one rotation and one more rotation to get over there. So go back to my sword or my weapon object. So there's my 90. That gives me to lean to the left. 0 should put me back to normal. And then I'm going to copy this piece. I'm going to paste that inside of my else here, just after my positioning piece. And this is the attack with sword. And then, so I've determined that my next angle should be 270 degrees based on how my sword is angled. And I will hit the play button. And now when I click the button with the sword, it should do some magic. So I'm going to grab this, equip it, and then when I click, it swings down and back up. Bam. Other side, down and back up. Bam. Good enough. We're not going to do the hitbox for this weapon just yet. We'll wait a little bit because we're going to set up the bow and then make sure everything works for there. So with that, we're going to conclude this, and I will see you guys in the next video. Hopefully this has been educational for you, and see you next time.